going, right? That's
Okay, fast or slow?
kind of slow.
Huh?
Kind of slow.
Okay. Yeah, Jerry and I have never figured that out yet. All right. We're going to take up where we left off 2 weeks ago, the last time we met. And we are trying to astrologize the individuality and the spirituality. And that's an almost impossible thing to do. It's difficult to describe and explain the emotionality and the personality and the mentality, and those are concrete things. The words and symbols are inadequate to those. So when we try to do that with transcendental things, which are well beyond anything concrete, things get much more difficult. Now, last time, or we've established so far, that a spiritual entity, a being, is the consequence of threefold spiritual activity. Three things working together. 3 points of view from 3 states of spirit come to form an objectified spiritual being. Now, this is a profoundly deep and mysterious activity which takes place over eons of time. For a self to be born is not something that happens in an instant. Now, this process, we have of it a very distant analogous activity in the physical world. It is called triangulation. Mariners travel over the sea, all over the world, and sometimes, because of tides and winds and things like that, they need to determine where they are. And that can only be done in reference to 2 points, 2 known places in space. So the navigator on a ship uses a sextant. I actually have a sextant, and it's a neat little thing. And what they do is they shoot the sun or they shoot the stars, and then from tables, they know where they are on the ocean. Of course, this is now a little obsolete with global positioning, but you could tell pretty accurately even before then. Now, in spiritual triangulation, looking from the bottom up, we're trying to determine not where we are, but what we are and who we are. And so from above, from the spirit, triangulation is something like a profound dance. And in that dance, the 3 points of view from 3 states of spirit position themselves relative to each other, and they produce a being once they have locked together to become a being. Now, what we're giving here is an enormously simplified statement. It's something that's so difficult and so deep that very few human beings have ever been able to reach it with turning inward. As we said last time, the 3 states of spirit are divine spirit, life spirit, and human spirit. And what we're saying is that divine spirit is indicated by Pluto. Life spirit is indicated by Uranus, and human spirit is indicated by Neptune. That's at this time in evolution. Now, there are other fruitful symbolic designations that could be given to them, and they would be meaningful, but that would complicate things to the great confusion. This kind of thing is esoteric astrology. astrology to get at the hidden mysteries, especially the spiritual mysteries, and that's incredibly difficult. Before there can be a discrete spirit, there has to be a will to be. And in the theogony of a human self, that is the fundamental activity of the divine spirit. In applied astrology, Pluto represents will, pure will, raw will, which requires nothing outside of itself to manifest its ends. Now, since we humans are in so low of a conscious evolution, Pluto is usually to us seen as arbitrary, and it seems like power for the sake of power. Now, Nazi Germany, for example, arose just about the same time that Pluto was discovered, and that's very Plutonian or very fascistic. What happens is because we're swimming up, like from the bottom of a pond to the surface, we tend to develop the lower or the underside or the negative poles of any state of being. A good example is when we are infants, there is the chemical ether, and we gain control over the negative pole before we gain control of the positive pole. When we're born, we don't have control over either. And we're just nothing but shit and snot and everything else that's eliminated through the negative pole, but we overcome that. But it takes quite a while after the negative pole has been overcome before the positive statement of will in an infant's body can overpower certain foods. There are some things that the spirit as an infant cannot overpower, and so that takes a while. And that's a good example of how we are working from the bottom up. In this, the power of will in human beings in general, since we're swimming from the bottom up, we look at the negative manifestations of Pluto. So in astrology, most often we find Pluto associated with obsessions and compulsive activities and things like that. And that's its manifestation. Now, before there can be a discrete human being, there has to be something more than the will to be. There has to be something to receive that receptivity and to hold it, receive that will and hold it into being, or at least hold the effects of it in being. And that which draws it into its receptivity and holds things together is love with a capital L. It is unconditioned and it is unconditional love. In humans, in our consciousness, if we're very fortunate, that is manifest in us as altruism. We love everyone, and there is nothing that can skew or twist that love. If it's twistable, it isn't altruism. Now, because it is unconditioned and it has this infinite capacity to receive and conceive, it's not specific. And so that conceptual or receptive ability is what is called pure imagination. Pluto represents darkness, and even more than darkness, it represents invisibility. And Uranus, which represents life spirit, represents light, the purest kind of spiritual light that you can think of, the light of truth, the indubitable light that you know can't be anything but true. Now, in this world that we're living in, we have an analogy of that. We have the sun. And the sun is a bunch of invisible nuclei with nuclear reactivity. And that produces light. And out of that light, everything else is born. It's not the same light as the Uranian spiritual light, but the light remains and it sustains all of the things that are conceived in it, but it is not limited to any of them. It's awful, you might say, or what it emanates out of it is what it lasts or is seen afterwards. Now, in our current human state, we tend to look more at differentiations. We tend to look at the things that are produced by light, and that they are being produced. Then we look at the common source of light itself. And for this reason, Uranus represents very separated kinds of things like iconoclasm and idiosyncrasies and personal altruism that gets spread out to many people, so that things like communism and socialism and things like that are ruled by Uranus. Now, the timelessness of the instantaneousness of Uranus becomes to us revolutionary. And Uranus in our lives wants us to do things now, and it wants to make changes now because it has that vision of everything living in altruistic harmony. And if it can be done in spirit, we should be able to accomplish it in matter, but that doesn't happen that way. We're rather slow about it. So true altruism and true universal love are pretty rare. And true or pure will is also pretty rare. But fortunately, both are coming up. There's greater ascendancy in both. Now, in our English language, the word being is used in both an active and a passive sense. On one hand, we say he has his being in the forest, or we say he is being bad. Makes our language difficult to learn, but it is wonderful for its spiritual ambiguity, or showing two different facets of the same thing. The third principle, or the third being in the triune being, is activity. The individuality that is produced when there is a complete threefold spirit is usually described in terms of its activity. We don't always say the spirit or the self, we say the thinker, that one that is doing the thinking, or the leader, the one that is doing the leading, the creator, and so on. So, at the same time, it seems both invisible in itself and unchanged, but it is in its invisibility and in its eternal being, it is also active. Things happen around it. And that's very hard for us to understand here. We're used to, like if you want to get something moving, you actually touch it. And it's not that things happen because of it in that more indirect way. So this is ruled by Neptune. And Neptune is the master magician. That's its spiritual nature. But again, human beings tend to respond more to the lower side. We're making our way up for fresh air. And the lower side likes the effects of doing and of magic but not necessarily the effort. It takes effort to become self-conscious. Consequently, we have Neptune ruling things like intoxication or drugs, alcohol, special effects that are neat special effects, but they're not meaningful. The lower Neptune can be so passive and wanting things to happen so easily that it'll even allow the body to be overtaken, as in mediumship. Now, very few have the patience and determination to control the finer forces of nature, which is what magic is. And you have to develop that within yourself and do that from within yourself. It is very rare that we find the Neptunian in completion, in objectification, in genius, or in magic. Now, in this little review that we've been doing here for the first few minutes, it's clear that what we're presenting here is very infantile. The reality is something very big and very profound. And even the greatest among humans are in awe of every aspect of the spirit. With astrology, the most we can hope for at this time is to point to something in the planets, something that represents the state of spirit, and then we can tune in and have an intuitive understanding. That's probably the best attitude to hold. Now, just a few minutes ago we said that the three states of spirit, the three spiritual viewpoints, have a stance with regard to each other to produce a formation of consciousness. There is an ideal stance between them, and it is symbolized in spiritual mathematics by the equilateral triangle. That is a perfect balance between each of the three states of spirit. However, in the evolutionary creation, nothing is static. And things change because there are differentials. And so there are differentials in applications of the three aspects of the spirit in order to accomplish things. And with these changes of stance, the consciousness of being is changed within, and it changes everything that is created by it. Now, this is the equilateral triangle, is the perfect case. Different stances, you can take it all the way. If you want to think about it, you can take it all the way. This is a threefold here. So there are all of these different stances that go into producing a threefold spirit. But along the way, you might say, if they were shifting back and forth, you would say that there's an infinite number of triangles. But there are some classic triangles in there. The isosceles right triangle is the basis of cosmic construction in form. And the 30-60-90 triangle is for the justification of life and form, or spirit and matter. And the 1, 2 square root of 5 triangle is for cosmic proportioning, which allows for manifest growth, not just construction, but growth. So each of these triangulations, the classics and all of the myriad of other ones, has an attitude about it. And as the changes occur, which are part of this dance or this relationship of the three viewpoints of spirit, there are changes in consciousness between them, within them, and a result of them. Now, this is active on many, many levels. And some of the changes are extremely long in duration and some are very short. For example, right now in the evolution of human consciousness, we are in the middle of a shift of emphasis from the human spirit to the life spirit. Now, this is going to take many millennia, but eventually the religion of the Christ in the life spirit will supersede the religion of Jehovah in the human spirit. And so a loving unity will prevail over active separatism, and separatism will have to be manifest within that unity without detracting from it. Now, the terms that I just used are terms that are used in the Christian religion, but it doesn't have to be in those terms. It can be in any terms that describe what's happening in the consciousness. Now, another example of this is for the past 60 years, Pluto has been sextile to Neptune. This means that a sweep of many millions of people are consciously or unconsciously unfolding within an attitude and spirit that wherein the will is controlling spiritual magic or spiritual active manifestation. And people in that generation can understand that by looking at the charts of many people in whom that is prominent. Now let's look at it yet another level. It can take place on the scale of cellular activity. A cell has a period of high activity in which it divides. And then there is a period of latency where it almost doesn't do anything. And then there is a period that it functions, and it continues to function until it builds up the energy, and then there's another period of activity. And those are the three stages ruled by the threefold spirit, one being almost changeless, one being functional, ongoing with life, and one being creative activity. Now you can see this same kind of a cycle in physical evolution on the earth, involved with geology. There are cataclysms. And after the cataclysms, when the dust settles, or when the new species have to be brought in to learn lessons or to accommodate through a new type of environment. And then there is a steady ongoing progress until things build up and there's a necessity for change, and then there's another cataclysm. So here we're talking about things in terms of many millions of years. So the same thing that happens on the cellular level and that happens in our evolution of consciousness within our generation, or that happens over many millions of years in the evolution of consciousness, they're all based on the interplay of these three same spiritual outlooks. Now, these are just a few scant examples, and they're not well developed, but we can see that there is a constantly shifting emphasis on many levels in many ways between the three aspects of the spirit. All right, now it's time to have another correction. We have to go back and go to something that we said earlier. Now, just a very few minutes ago, we said that a correlation of the three states or three viewpoints of spirit resulted in a formation of consciousness. In that, it was tacitly implied that consciousness was in the whole. From this, one might even conclude or think that consciousness was a composite. And there is some truth to that, but it's not exactly true, because consciousness is something that is a much more pure thing, and it can have different flavors or take different attributes on it, but consciousness is consciousness. So the idea of it as being a composite is not a complete truth. Now, the last time we met, we started this whole discourse on the threefold spirit, and we said that the threefold spirit formed around a virgin spirit. Now, again, it's not unreasonable to say that the threefold spirit issued from or issued within the virgin spirit. Now, the same kind of dichotomy persists between the three attributes and the central consciousness around the virgin spirit that is shared by them. So, it seems equally valid to say that the center of consciousness brings about a change in the relationship of the three states of spirit that seems to issue from them. Now, transcendental causality and causation are very different from causation in the phenomenal worlds, especially in the physical world that we're in now. In fact, it's difficult and complex to understand because our consciousness is weak. Now, this way of looking at things doesn't invalidate the time-honored way of seeing things, that divine spirit, things pass from the divine spirit to the life spirit to the human spirit, as if it were one above the other and it is descending into materiality or something like that. That's still a perfectly valid way to look at it. But even in that statement, there is a two-way street. So that we can see that the relations between each of the attributes of the spirit work both ways. We can say, for example, that the divine spirit informs the life spirit, and it informs it with what becomes life, light. But another way of looking at it, since they're working cooperatively together, and spirit is spirit, and there is a common unity or oneness about them, is that the life spirit draws out the divine spirit. And in some ways that's even more viable way of looking at things, because that allows the divine spirit to be more passive, or not passive, but not overtly active, which would weaken it. Now, we could say the same thing about the relationship between the life spirit and the human spirit, but that would be too much like a talk in class in Trinity rather than in astrology. In transcendental things, in spirit, things are present simultaneously. And causality is more like logic than like an application of force, logic of a higher kind. Many years ago, I tried to go into this. I started a series of talks on the myths of triangles. And at that time, I only got to the Oedipus myth, which took about 5 or 6 talks, and the myth of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. And at that point, I felt the need to leave off from doing that, partly because I was too immature, and partly because it was too tedious for the class that I had. I would sometime, now that I'm a little more mature, I'd like to return to it, but I don't know if that's going to happen, because there are all sorts of triangle myths that give great insight to the way things work in the spirit. All right. Back on topic, we can now discuss the reality that a threefold objectification results in a being, and that being is reflected or issues from a center of consciousness. And what we're saying is that center of consciousness is what is called in Christian mysticism a virgin spirit. And we're also saying that this theogony is a two-way street. The central spirit focuses or affects the threefold spirit, just as the threefold spirit affects the central focus. And this is shown in one of the most holy of all symbols, which is called the all-seeing eye. Sometimes it's called the eye in the triangle, meaning to say that the black spot in the middle, which on the blackboard is white, is like the virgin spirit. And the focus of being that is in it is what the sun represents, and the interaction with the threefold attributes are what is indicated by the triangle. So this bidirectional activity is found in the basic cosmology of the sun and the solar system. Some very sage people say that the sun is the focus of the zodiacal hierarchies, which are made up of stars from other systems, and that their focus is what becomes the sun. Others say, and they're equally right, that the zodiac is a projection of the sun. And both of these have legitimacy, and both of them are very fruitful if you start pondering them. Personally, I don't think that one view has primacy over the other, but I don't know enough that I can really say that that is something factual. So this brings us to where we want to be. In spiritual astrology, the sun represents the center of spirit, the center of the eye in the triangle. The sun represents the individuality, the self, the essential being. The spiritual ego has many different names, indicating that it's a mystery. Things that we don't know, we give many different names to. In this, it is the mask of the Virgin Spirit, and it is ultimately the manifestation of the potential of the Virgin Spirit. The sun in astrology brings out special problems for both the astrologer and for the native whose horoscope one is looking at. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise to us, because the problem of the self is one of the most difficult problems in all spiritual endeavor. Some schools of thought try to annihilate the self. which, if successful, would do untold millions of eons of immeasurable love that went into its development. And what was the individual would be rendered evolutionarily useless, impotent. Suicide is never pretty. Some schools try to overpower the self, which, if possible, something that I doubt, would produce a monster ego. In the first place, who would be doing the mastering? And what would be mastered? And if there were that much hubris, you might say, put into that activity, how would that kind of individuality fit into unity? Now, the situation or the solution that is put forth by Christianity seems to me to be the best. But it doesn't have to be expressed in Christian terminology. That view stresses the giving over of self to Christ. If you put it in different words, it is the intent and the function of the self given to what is called the over-self. Or better, the selfness, which represents all selves because all selves come from it, which means a giving over to the life spirit. In this view, one continues to develop as an individual, but never out of harmony with the unity of the threefold spirit, because it is always with a view to the unifier or the healer or the collector of the threefold spirit. In this, there is humility, so that ego doesn't become unbounded. Actually, there's even a sidestepping of egoism if this is done correctly. However, before you can give a self over to selfness, there has to be a self. And one has to know what it is, and one has to be able to give this over. And this brings us back to the sun as self in astrology. Now, in popular astrology, there is the sun and nothing else. All the other planets and the signs and houses are just a rumor. And it would be something nice to look into if there were time to do it. What really counts is me. I am what is important. And that's what most people focus on in astrology. There's a lot of egoism as people look at astrology. This is called sun sign astrology. And sun sign astrology is what you find in the newspapers. It is crude, and it is vague, and it leads to gross generalization. But if you think about it, self-consciousness is also pretty vague. It's one thing that's always with us. We're always, as long as we are alive and we are awake and as long as we are doing things, it's always with us. It has an eternal quality in that. But we're at a loss to be able to describe what it is. The best we can do in describing it is to do something and to be aware of ourselves as we're doing it. Then we know ourselves in the doing. This is why the self, or the ego with the capital E, is a doer. It is an actor. When we are alive and we're awake and we're conscious, the presence of self doesn't seem to have any boundaries to it. It's timeless, or better, eternal. But yet, that state of consciousness is pretty vague and shallow. Since the knower is capable of knowing anything in the universe, there has to be something of it in the universe, unless you want to believe in fantasies like parallel universes. So there has to be something of self in the things that we know about. And so that is a kind of spatial universality, but it's not something that we know, that we experience. It's logical that it has to be. There are moments when we know ourselves more clearly, and we know ourselves especially clearly with regard to things that we do. Now, if we are extremely fortunate and extremely blessed, we may have momentary experiences of what some call the baptism by the Holy Spirit, which is an awakening in the Spirit. It's called by other names in other cultures. For example, in India, it's called Savalkalpa Samadhi. But even these states are only just the beginning. Astrology is helpful to self-awareness and to self-consciousness. And the sun is central to doing that. Even though astrology doesn't remove all of these problems that we've been talking about, and it even adds a few of its own, but it's helpful. Now, the sun isn't always the strongest astrological factor in working out the destiny of a given lifetime, but it's always central. Whether it is the strongest or not, it's always central. So just as the sun is the heart and the center of the solar system, which is our current field of evolution, so the astrological sun indicates the central purpose to every rebirth and why all of the other planets are doing what they're doing. The other planets may be stronger so that we can develop specific talents and have specific and solve specific problems, but the sun is still the center of orientation. Now, if the sun is extremely weak in comparison, one may lose sight of oneself to talents and activities. It often happens. We get carried away so much in what we're doing that we aren't aware of ourselves, and we lose ourselves. If the sun is extremely strong, there may be a self-preoccupation that is more important or that supersedes all of the activities, for better or worse. Now, in earlier spiritual endeavor, self-consciousness was attained in watching one's thoughts. One watched one's thoughts and then transferred one's attention to the watcher. That's a somewhat passive way of looking at things. There's functionality in it. It's something the way a king rules his kingdom by watching over it and being watched by his subjects for strength and direction, but it's not really an active or a hands-on way. Now, modern spirituality is much more active. One watches what one is doing, not what is just happening, especially thinking. One thinks. One does not just watch thoughts, and then awakens and transfers attention to the thinker. That's a very different way of looking at self. Now, because the self is more engaged in the activity and how things are going about, it tends to bring the spirit, it tends to bring the self more into its vehicles, which is an evolutionary goal at this time. So this promotes spiritual growth and creative evolution at the same time. Modern spiritual students say that we think. Thoughts don't just happen. Either way, positioning and especially aspects to the sun in a horoscope are extremely important to self-knowing, to self-becoming. If you have an unaspected sun, it often means an insipid, almost purposeless kind of life. There is, in something like this, if the self is really weak, there's the danger of dissociation and what is called psychological fractionation, where different parts of the psychology take off and do their own thing. Extreme cases, those different parts become even more autonomous, and they become like multiple personalities. With such a horoscope, a person has to work in earnest to self-consciousness, but not as an escape from doing and from controlling. Now, because we're in such a state of limited self-consciousness, much of our self-consciousness is indirect. Much of our self-knowledge is indirect. We don't have that awakening in the Holy Spirit. Even the method of transferring consciousness or of watching is reflective. It is as if right now we can't apperceive the self directly. And this has been known in mysticism for a long time. The mystic of the 14th century, Meister Eckhart, said, "One does not see God with the same eye that one sees a cow," meaning to say you can't look at spirit that way. The Bible puts the indirect knowledge in a statement, very simple, very beautiful, "By their fruits ye shall know them." There's a famous quote. I tried to find it on the internet, but I couldn't find it, and it goes somewhat to the effect of, I think it used to be attributed to Beethoven, but I think he might have gotten it from somewhere else. It is like, in the act of creation, there is something that goes beyond the Creator. That in the creation, it is like you are let to use something that is miraculous. What isn't understood is that that is what the Spirit is. That thing that we think goes beyond us, that is the real us. And that's exactly what the state is with most people with regard to self. It is as if it is something outside or beyond or beside themselves. And it is in this regard that the sun should be treated in the horoscope. It is behind everything that occurs in the solar system. And in the horoscope, the self is behind everything that occurs within the general character. The entire horoscope is itself a solar system. If we look at this circle with a point in it, that's the sun. That's no different than looking at the mandala with this being the central focus of the sun. So this is an outlook that carries, it's a symbol that where the analogy carries at every level of manifestation of self. The sun, greater and lesser, whether it is the whole horoscope and solar system or whether it is just the sun itself, still always has to be seen as central purpose. Our lives have purpose, and the more we can attune ourselves to that central purpose, the better our lives are for us. Now this brings us to one of the central problems facing our humanity, especially if we're trying to grow spiritually, and it carries us into an analogous astrological problem. At one time in our human evolution, we jumped the gun with regard to creative activity. We took the creative force into our hands and used it before we understood when and how and where it should be used. And what resulted was called the fall of man. And the falling in that fall was to go deeper into matter, deeper into ignorance, and deeper into defiant separation from the unity of things. Before the fall, we were directed or guided completely by the gods or by the creative hierarchies. They led us around willy-nilly. But when we took the creative force in our hands, we were declaring divinity. And the gods cannot be gods without respecting the divine nature of every other being. And so the gods had to back off. That doesn't mean they didn't care about us, because they could see that we still needed help. Because falling didn't create our ignorance, it didn't cure our ignorance, it just magnified it. And we had even greater problems with the blindness that was coming from materialism. Now in this, it's not as though we went from being sinless beings that were led around like little lambs, not that we went from being completely innocent to being completely sinful. We still were quite innocent for quite a long time. And we cooperated as much as possible. In fact, some of us realized, we really need this, and we didn't know that this was going to come out, be a result of what we've done. And some were more willing to create with the hierarchies because of it. But in a distant period of time, in what the latter part of was called the Lemurian epoch, and in the earlier part of what is called the Atlantean epoch, we began, as a result of doing things in ignorance and doing things selfishly, we began to experience the difference between selfishness and unselfishness, between attraction and repulsion. And the more we became aware of that difference, it made a change in our emotional nature. It made a change in our desire bodies, so that there was the things that we were aware of attractive, harmonious, positive, right, good things versus those that brought with them all kinds of trouble and separation and things like that. And this causes stratification. And the gods, while we were still innocent enough and willing to cooperate, helped us through the budding mind and the beginning of the spirit that was coming in to cause a reflection of the self into the desire body so that it could control all of our motivations. And this self was meant to be a regent, you might say. A regent is a protector of a king until the king comes of age. You know, like you have somebody like Henry, what was it? Henry VI had a regent, I believe, that was in charge of his life. And so this was meant to take care of number one. And what happened is it did that. And it did that pretty well. And over time, it was purloined by the same spiritual entities that tempted us to use the creative force before we were ready. And so it, even though it was only a pseudo-self, had a pseudo desire for power. You can't reflect part of the self and not all of it. Even though it is a reflected image, you can't reflect only part of it. It's the whole thing. And so it became self-seeking, and it did a good job of that. And at the same time, we were becoming more and more focused into matter, so it was unconscious to the little bit of waking consciousness we have in the dense physical body, so that both the true self and the pseudo-self, which we now call the personal ego, lower nature, animal soul, whatever you want to call it, that both of them were relatively unconscious. And we find ourselves doing things we don't want to do, but that satisfy this lower nature in a revelment in desire, because that's where it gets its jollies, so to speak. And so we have this divided, split nature. We have a true and a false self, and a struggle for motivation. The false self even serves a divine purpose in being a resistance to the true self. And in that struggle between the two selves, the divided self, you might say, the true self becomes strong and becomes aware of the world in the struggle. This is the struggle that all of us who are trying to grow spiritually are working on. We're trying to tame that lower nature and bring it back into the service of the Spirit rather than letting it run off on its own for its own ends and then be used by beings that do not have our good ends in mind. All right. This problem of having two selves works into astrology in the fact that both the higher nature, the true self, the spiritual ego, and the lower nature, or the pseudo-self, or the personal ego, both are represented by the sun. This problem pervades the total character so thoroughly that the whole horoscope can be seen as either the higher nature, what it's trying to accomplish in terms of creative destiny, or it can be seen as the lower nature in terms of all the machinations that it is trying to use for personal satisfaction. This means then that the sun can be seen in both a higher and a lower manifestation much more than any other planet. Now, in this series of talks, we like to talk a lot about relative significance. and how relative significance of what is important and not important is all, you can't do any astrology without it. And so we have this elaborate estimation system, which is still very infantile, but that system does not clarify whether the manifestation of the sun or any of the planets or the whole horoscope will be higher or lower. And so we are thrown back on the fundamental things of astrology. We have to observe. We have to observe whether someone is acting from the higher nature or from the lower nature, or to what extent from either. And we have to intuit. We have to intuit what's going on here. And then we have to have good judgment. Someone may be very well intended in the higher nature, but if they're responding to the strongest aspect in the chart from the lower nature, the good intentions may not bring anything that we would suggest to the native to be something positive, but rather something negative. So, once again, you can see we have opened up something that requires us to be keenly conscious of what's going on. And we have opened up something that is extremely large, way too large for what we're doing now. I don't want to spend another class talk directed to this problem, though I could easily do that. And so it'll have to come in dribs and drabs when we are doing the applied work and looking at the sun. But as an example, let's do one more thing for the understanding of the sun and of the self. And we do that through the simplest kind of astrology, keyword astrology. If you find what are the central, most important keywords for the sun and ponder them in life and in yourself, you will be able to make inroads into understanding the self. Now, one keyword that we're going to use as an example is identification. So the position of the sun by sign in house and the aspectation of the sun indicates what the sun is working through, or what it's trying to accomplish, or how it's trying to become aware of itself as a creative being or in its creative activity. For example, a classical example, if the sun is in Gemini, the sun identifies itself through thinking. Good example of that is Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe had the sun in Gemini, and she tried to identify as a thinker. She didn't have all the equipment, but that's the way she tried to identify herself. The sun in the 10th house self-identifies through status perspective. And if the sun is an aspect, say something with like Mars, it self-identifies through dynamic doing. Again, it's a matter of by their fruits you shall know them. And so this can have a higher or a lower manifestation, and probably is working on both fronts at the same time. God is not going to waste a lifetime looking only on one lower view of things. There's something, how does Hamlet say it? There's a divinity that shapes our lives, rough hew them though we may. The sun, by the same token, is a portal to the spirit that's behind the total character. In insecurity, it may, if it's the pseudo-self, it doesn't have the strength of divinity. And the pseudo-self is always insecure. And if you're insecure, you tend to lean on things in order to bolster yourself, and you lean on them by identifying with them. In the state of Wisconsin, we have a lot of people who identify through the Green Bay Packers. It's a kind of identification. If a person has the sun in the 9th house, they might identify in a personal level and put all of their insecurities in religion. They might even not be true spiritual seeking. Or if someone feels weak and insecure with the sun in the 7th house, they might marry a strong partner. And somebody who's weak in such a way that they have to domineer, they might marry somebody who is weak so that they can be domineering over them. There are a lot of those kinds of marriages. So we can see that the possibilities in just simple placements and simple aspectations in the chart help us to understand the self and to understand the pseudo-self. We can get a gist of how the process of the true self taming the other is going on. Now, all you need is a good list of keywords for the sun, and you can do this for each one of those keywords, and that will bring you to an awareness of self, and in your chart and in the process of selfhood altogether. If you want to look at many charts of famous people, just by looking at the sun, you can come to that. And that's as far as we're going to go this evening. And hopefully we'll reconvene again in fall, but if it's going to be just Mark and I and Scott or Jerry, I don't know. I might just do things from the basement and do it with voice only. So thank you very much. Scott, do you have any questions? No. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just hit the stop, and that's all that's necessary. Did you hit it already?
No.
That's from there.